Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where it's about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Pennyworth. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, obviously, we had the conversation between, the CIA, Thomas and Lucius about the whole, storm cloud situation. And the U.S. government is like, kind of leave it be. And it's just kind of like, wait, what? A whole bunch of people are going to die. Even Thomas is like, no, we can intervene in this. And it's like, no, their ultimate end goal is for the war to end. Like, obviously, from the very beginning, they've always been backing the winner, but it's like, these are innocent people that are going to die. Like, we can't really be supporting this, but it's like, the president wants this war to be over. Wouldn't this be the fastest way? And it's like, what's going on. It's like, then we'll say we don't. And obviously, you don't want to be caught up in, if you try to expose this, basically, there'll be ramifications for you. So Thomas just kind of ends there and things and being like, yep, we accept it. Which Lucius like, what are you doing? You're just going to be complacent. But it's like, there's no point in talking to them. They're dead set in what they're going to do. You can hold them off, tell them what you think of them. It's like, it doesn't matter. They know what they are. You're not going to change their mind. So we're going to have to do something on our own. But that is a sad thing that the U.S. government knows that so many lives are going to be at stake, and they're kind of making that choice to do this. Now, whether the president fully supports that in the notion of, hey, I 100% know what's going on, but it's like the whole thing of plausible deniability. But it almost makes you wonder, is that something 100% the president kind of signs off on, or are you kind of speaking for the president? But nevertheless, Thomas ends up calling up Martha, and it's like, we need to talk. Which, hearing that conversation back and forth, them both being like, oh yeah, it's something that can't be settled from right. It's like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And they're like, okay. And even Lucius being like, I guess you're not as bad as I thought you were, Thomas. He was like, kind of like, And Thomas was like, what? He was like, nothing, just, Also like, do you like to drink? And he was like, I will drink you under the porch, Thomas. And even them over drinks him being like, oh yeah, I didn't like you at first, Thomas, but now I actually do. I recognize you as kind of like the anal retentive type of just kind of like seeing like, what was it, like almost borderline saying like he has borderline schizophrenia, like some small sense of like schizophrenia or something. He's like, well, I didn't like you very much when I met you, Lucius. Jury's still out on that one. So, interestingly enough, obviously shows up and warns Martha about everything. And obviously for her, she's like, She's proud because it's like, you're actually doing the right thing. Because even Lucius is proud of that. Because he was like, I thought I had you pegged on who I thought you were. But even Thomas is like, what? Did you really think I was going to let a whole bunch of people get massacred? It's like, yeah, but we thought you tried to justify it or something like that. But it's like, but even Lucius being like, look at her. She's kind of got you pegged. I mean, I think out of anyone, Martha knows him the best and kind of can see through him in a way like no one else can. But at the end of the day, it's actually interesting because him and Alfred are very similar in that regard of like, yeah, they have their own ambitions and everything. And it's like, how far are they going to let stuff go just to let their, just to be able to reach their goals and ambitions? They put up in the front of being these cold-hearted people, and they can be a little detached and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, they are kind of good-natured in their own right of like, they both want to try and do the right thing when the time comes. Granted, just kind of getting there to doing the right thing is kind of a bit of a bumpy road, but they get there eventually, And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing. It almost makes Alfred and Thomas almost like these two peas in a pod. It's almost because even later on, Thomas being like, this is almost this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, and Alfred's like, yeah, I don't think so. So it just makes where they end up that much more interesting. That obviously they butt heads, but I think maybe that's probably what Thomas wants. He wants someone around that's not going to be a yes man, someone that's always going to cooperate. I mean, that's also, I think Martha plays that role too, because it's like, yeah, like Martha doesn't like take his bullshit. She's like, when she doesn't like what he says, she'll call him out and kind of like knock him down a peg or two if she needs to. But obviously Patricia's there too, and obviously I also love her being like, who are you? And he's like, Lucius. She's like, say that again. He was like, Lucius. She's like, I like the tone in which he was saying it or something like that. I was like, and then the way Lucius almost like, yeah. And just like, I was like, wait, are we going to potentially set up a Lucius and Patricia thing in the future? That'd be interesting if that ends up being the case. I mean, when you actually think about it, let's not forget Alfred and Martha kissed in the first season. I mean, that doesn't mean much, but it's still got to be that thing of like, all right, Just I don't know. It'd be interesting if a lot of intersection happens in that regard. Just the fact that Lucius was like, was kind of being like stopped for words in that moment. I just thought was so fascinating. But probably reading too much into it. But trying to get all of them out of London. But when the time comes, Thomas doesn't leave because for him, he wants to stick around and try and do the right thing because leaving would just be running away from the thing, which that's something Alfred has to deal with. Obviously, like he's packing up, leaving with his mom. Gully shows up and it's like, oh, gulp. Because you're like, does he know? And it seems like first, I don't know if he went into this having suspicions because he comes over and he's like, you're acting like you got something to hide, Alfred. Even later on saying it's almost like Alfred was afraid of me. Oh yeah, afraid of you? The sociopath that you are? But I think it's because he knows Alfred so well. It's like Alfred kind of has like a will of steel. So it's like, oh, if you're afraid of me, that means you have something to hide. So he probably came into it with some inkling, but who knows? Maybe it really was seeing Alfred so afraid. And it was like, now what could you have done that would make you so afraid of me that you know that you'd kind of cur my wrath? Only thing I can think of is Melanie. So I don't know, like, whether that was just him playing because he already had some idea. Maybe running into Alfred just confirmed it. And the way Melanie would act it, Which is interesting, too, because Melanie has showed up at Alfred's place. He's like, what are you doing? Like, she's like, oh, Gully has no idea. And he was like, do you have a death warrant? She's like, oh, now we're getting all personal and stuff like that. Because it almost seemed like you were pushing the limits, lady. But I guess it's almost like, oh, it makes their affair that much sweeter and much more like, ooh, like so much dangerous and sexy is of a little layer of danger to it. Because even Gully asking him was like, oh yeah, like, want to go on this job? Which I'm like, I'm curious what that final job would have been. I also kind of get the feeling, like, part of me is like, is that going to be a setup and Gully's going to kill you at the end of it? I mean, obviously, if people are no longer useful to him or kind of cross him in some shape or form, we've seen what he does. We've seen, like, when he doesn't like what Melanie says, he'll slap her. We saw when people kind of are too much of a problem to keep around, he put his one of his people down. So, if... which Alfred kind of checks all those boxes. So I'm like, this next job probably would have ended with Gully putting a bullet in your head or setting it up to make it seem like, hey, we're going to go to a job. Oh, and I'm tapping you out. I don't know. Once again, maybe he could have genuinely been like, oh, let's go on this last job together. But Alfred's like, yeah, I'm going to America. It's like, oh, you're just going so. It's like, no, like, it's like you could go at any point in time. It's about, no, the tickets are already paid for. Everything's kind of set in motion. So kind of need to go tomorrow. But, what I thought was also really interesting is that obviously he shows at the club and he runs into Sandra and her dad. And Sandra's dad is basically like, fuck off. And Alfred's like, fair play. And he sits down with Lucius and Thomas. And obviously there's people in there, I'm assuming from the Ravens. Obviously he's like starting up trouble singing like, I guess, kind of like a national anthem of like, yeah, we're top dogs, we're amazing. Sandra gets on stage and she kind of drowns them out. Using her song and her voice to kind of, show like, oh, like we're not like, this isn't your place to kind of do whatever you want to, because you're trying to almost like rub it in people's faces, being obnoxious and drunk and loud like that, being like, yeah, we're in control. But it's like in that moment, not only just Sandra raising up her voice, everyone in the bar singing with her, and those people kind of quiet down. But it's like in this moment, I think it was supposed to be like everyone outside of this, like, this is a neutral zone. And I guess it was almost like putting them in like, hey, putting those people in their place, being like, yeah, like, this isn't your place to do that. Kind of almost like London coming together in that moment to kind of push back a little bit. Like, we're here in England. Like, for England, this is our home, and we're kind of pushing back a little bit. And I thought what's interesting, though, is like you see in that moment, Alfred's kind of like, I think he has a lot of regrets, because for him, I think also realizing like, yeah, Sandra's such a special girl that like, even without me, she's going to shine so brightly. And also being like, oh yeah, like I'm such an idiot. Like I've been so caught up in my own BS that, because I think it also hit him, because these are people in their own right. That's them kind of standing up, standing united. It's like they're willing to fight for their home, and like, stand up for it. And what is he doing? He's running away, not just from this, everything, his entire life, all that he's known. And I think he has kind of regrets about that, I'm sure all the Sandra stuff also like adds a layer to it. But this really crazy thing was the Gully and Melanie thing. Now, obviously, like at first, he's like, oh, I know. I'm like, when he kept saying I know, I was like, you don't actually know, you have suspicions, and you want her to, like, she'll say it and he'll be like, oh, like, I didn't actually know, but I just needed you to confirm it, which maybe that is the case, which she does. Scared the shit out of me the moment he hit her. I was like, dude, I was like, he's gonna kill her, damn it. I was like, I was like, please, you should have left when you had a chance. Like, dude, like, the moment he showed up and she was pouring drinks and stuff like that, I was like, oh, God, please get out. And it's just like, I was like, oh, God, he's going to kill her. I was like, no. But luckily, she stabbed him. Like, oh, you're not going to kill him, are you? She doesn't, but she jacked him up. That was just like, that was the most, like, nerve-wracking scene of, like, oh, God, please don't kill her. I was actually worried the entire episode that he was going to pop up out of nowhere and kill her. Like, I don't know, just out of nowhere, and bam, she's dead. Like, maybe he shoots her from far away or something. Like, I was worried about something like it. Luckily, it doesn't happen. But Alfred's willing to help Melanie and being like, hey, like, for her, like, you know, it's like, Gully is out there, we don't know where he is, but it's like, you know, he's offering Melanie, hey, come to America too. And she's like, what? No, you don't mean that seriously. It's like, yeah. He's like, I'm asking you to come to America with me. I'm not telling you I'm going to marry you. And she's like, well, if you did, I'd tell you no. So, but because she had actually, I think it's in this particular scene, no, it was the first scene, I believe, of them together in this episode. She kind of calls Alfred out. She's like, yeah, I see you from kind of lying. And he's like, what? Like, you're putting up this front to be like this cold-hearted person that you are, but in actuality, you've got a good nature to you that it's like, because you're ashamed of who you are, because I think in a sense that he feels like if he remains kind-hearted, then he's weak and he'll get kind of trampled all over, because it's like, yeah, like the world doesn't respond to kind in a good way. Like if you're kind, the world will beat you down and take everything you hold important to you. I think that might be kind of Alfred's perspective on things, but it's also like to get through this world, you need to be cold-hearted. So he kind of puts up on that front and leans into it, but it's like, that's not who you are. She's even kind of saying like, oh, you're kind of a teddy bear at heart in that regard, and he kind of is. Like, despite everything else, Alfred does at the end of the day try to do the right thing to some sense. Like even when he was rescuing Lucius and them, he didn't want things to turn out that way, and it's like, shit, why didn't they listen? Why? Like it didn't have to end. None of them had to die. It didn't have to turn out that way. You know, he was actually kind of upset, because I think for him it's like, because I think it was probably just a reminder of everything from the previous job of Gully too, of just like, it wasn't supposed to go down that way. It's supposed to be a simple job, get some money. No one's supposed to die, because jobs have kind of been going a lot more sideways lately, because, you know, one ended with Bazza being dead. That one with Gully ended up with other people being dead, more blood on his hands. Then the whole thing with rescuing Lucius, you know, it's just one thing after another. It's just kind of like playing the role of the non-caring, you know, all I care about is money and stuff douchebag, and I only care about myself. It's like, that's not who you are, and I guess that's why things kind of go wrong, because it's you pretending to be something that you're not, pretending to be someone that you're not. Hell, I even love that scene when he's obviously drinking by himself, and it's his dad. He's like, kind of like, I don't care about your opinion, but still, you know, I'm making the right choice, right? And his dad's like, yeah, you're making sure that you and your mom are all right. It's like, yeah. It's like, yeah. I mean, come on, why stay and fight? You know, and brings up tides and stuff. You know, it's like, Sir Isaac Newton already figured it out. And he was like, wait, what? What are you talking? What? Figured what out? It's like tides, gravity. You know, it's like, yeah, I already know all about that. It's like, well, you can't fight gravity. And Alfred's like, oh, really? Throws something up and grabs it. And it's like, how about that? And then him and his dad have a little bit of a laugh. You know, I thought that was kind of a nice moment. But what I also really loved is when he goes to pick up his mom later, and his mom and Dave Boy, and then it's like, oh yeah, this is Melanie, and his mom's looking kind of annoyed, and he's like, it's a long story, and it's like, hey, hi, Miss Pennyworth, and then, well, Alfred's getting tickets, and she's like, well, is this your first time flying, Miss Pennyworth? And she's like, yes. She's like, oh, it's okay, like, it's not that scary. It's like, oh, you fly around a lot, huh? And it's like, yeah, you're experienced, aren't you? And it's like, yeah, I bet you're always on the move. I was like, look at her being so judgmental, and you have Dave Boy just kind of like looking around a little bit like, I'm super uncomfortable here. It's like, oh look, Alfred's back, everybody let's go. But when the time was coming, you could tell more and more that Alfred was reluctant, to the point he was like, I can't go. In that moment, I thought he was going to send Dave Boy, his mom, and Melanie, but like, I love his mom being like, what? He's like, I can't leave. And she's like, thank God, and walks away. And Dave was like, come on, Alfie, you know, because she was only going because Alfred was going, but she was kind of hoping this would happen. She's like, oh, thank God you don't want to go. Good, let's just go back home. You know, because for her, she was just waiting for Alfred to kind of come to this conclusion. But even if he didn't, and keeping an eye on him, she would have went to America with him, but kind of glad that, like, oh, you came to this realization on your own. And so he sends Melanie off because she's like, oh, we could have worked. And he was like, yeah, we could have, but, that time, find that time of independence. You kind of need to be on your own to kind of find all that out. And, he was like, oh, don't be sad. But she was kind of like, no, I'm not. It's interesting that they did hit it off. But she's like, if you're ever in America, which I'm like, is there some future in that? Once again, just on what I've known of Alfred against the adaptations, once again, not the most well-versed in the comics, but, I mean, Alfred's older, so he's always been single from what I'm aware of. I think Gotham's kind of touched on some love interest situations. I can't remember any off the top of my head. But once again, there's the whole Batwoman thing. Like, he has a kid with someone in Batwoman, but I still have to look it up. I got to remind myself to look it up, whether or not that's just a Batwoman thing or whether he actually has kids of his own in his comic books. I've never been aware of that. I mean, to be fair, I didn't find out, like, well after the fact that, like, obviously Bruce has a kid, that being Damian. But, I mean, even the thing is of Damian being kind of like a more, I say recent, but he's been in the comics for a while now. But he is still a kind of newer thing in the continuity of Batman. So, but still, that was a thing of like, wait, who the hell is this Damian kid? Wait, he's Bruce and whose kid? What? It's Talia's, right? Yeah, Talia. I actually had to think for a second. I was like, who's his mom? It's like, yeah, I think it's Talia. Regardless, tangents and all that. But it's just that's why I'm kind of like, oh, Melanie, maybe? I don't know. She's going to be in the States. Interesting enough, she's like, she runs into Patricia, who's like, oh, running from an abusive ex, and to me, like, what? She's got this weird insight to people. She's able to read people on some weird level. I thought that was kind of interesting. But it's like, oh, let's be on the flight together and have this talk, and about everything. I'm like, that's interesting. Now, that might be another bridge between the Wayne family and Alfred and potentially Melanie in that regard. We'll see how things kind of play out. But, it is ironic, though. All that time and all that Alfred's done to try to get to America at the end for him not to go, but for him to stick around and deciding to fight. It is a little funny, which I love Alfred being like, I don't see the humor in it, but if you say there is, sure. But obviously they show Aziz everything, which, now they've got to plan out. Because the whole thing is, if you go public, the president will have no choice but to go, damn, if with this information out here now, if I try to not do anything now, it's going to look bad of like, whoa, why isn't the U.S. interfering, even though it's publicly known that something terrible like this is going to happen. But I love Alfred and Aziz next to each other and being like, good to have you back in the fight. And he's like, well, you're still kind of a sneaky little bastard or something like that. But he's like, oh, I'm glad to be back too. And it's like, oh, and Lucius is like, you two have history. And it's like, they look at each other. It's like, oh, it's like, you could say that, Lucius. It's like, no, these two go back way, 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 way back. A lot of interesting, complicated feelings between these two. Another thing to also think about is, hey, your boy Gilly is still out there, and he's super pissed because he knows, hey, you banged my wife. Still two people, more so, that are still in London that you care about. Your mom, Melanie might have gotten away, but you're still in, well, he could always end up trying to track her down. Like he said, sadly, he's psycho enough to do that. But I think more so than anything, he can come after Alfie. Now, I'm sure it most likely would be in the form of going after someone you care about, that being Dave Boy and his mom. We'll see. Or there's still Sandra, even though they're not together, like she could still be collateral damage. We'll see. I just get the feeling, Gully being who he is, he plans on going after Alfie in the hardest way possible, and that seems that be the case. So it's going to be interesting to see where things go on the Gilly front as well. But obviously we have the Lord Hartwood situation where it's like, hey, he now realizes like, oh, Salt got the best of me. Now I'm kind of, to the public, it's like, oh, I'm sick. But it's like, I know the truth. And he's like trying to write letters to the public and everything, which Salt is kind of in charge of things now because he's like, oh, without so-and-so in charge, they'd kind of fall to me. But what's interesting is we kind of understand his motive a little bit more when he's like, oh yeah, like if we were to use Stormcloud, it'd be in Harwood's name. And that's what, like I said, that's what I've never understood the entire time. I'm like, Harwood has kind of been leaning towards using Stormcloud anyway, so it's like, I don't get why you're going about things this way. Like, he's kind of siding with you using it anyway, but I guess it's like, he's still always going to be, like, even when you got Gaunt out of the way, you still felt the need to kind of manipulate him so you can get him out of the way, too. So it's a figurehead situation where it's like, he wants everything to be done in Harwood's name, even Stormcloud, because I guess, like, the moment Stormcloud's used, all the backlash will fall on Harwood because it will all be done under his name. And then, oh, look, it's me, Salt. I'll rise up the ranks and become the true leader that you all, even though I'm the one that's behind making Stormcloud, will keep that hush-hush, but I'll come off looking like I'm the hero because not only did Harwood go along with it, even the military, the army's under his control and everything, but even they kind of sided with using it regardless. So at least I think that's what it's seeming like was Salt's intention. But you had that lady calling up Peg and letting her and Bet know, so they come in to bust Harwood out, which obviously he's getting a little sentimental because for him it's like, oh, the ladies that, the two most important ladies in his life, and it's like he wished he had actually stayed back with them when he was recovering rather than coming back to all this, realizing Salt played him for a fool and manipulated him. But it's like Salt won't let anything happen to him because he still needs me alive, because he needs whatever he has planned to fall back on my name. If I'm hurt or killed in any shape or form, it hinders his plan a little bit. But it's like, oh, they've shown up and everything. It's like, and Peg is like, we should have been out of here in 5 minutes. And Bet's like, don't nag him. And she's like, I wasn't nagging. I was just saying if we left like 5 minutes earlier, we would have been in a better circumstance. I even love her, like, Bet being like, oh, are those sandwiches owed? And he's like, Harwood's like, no, you should go ahead and take some. It's like, they're really good. I'm like, I love, like, how, like, the tone of when those three are together, like, completely shifts. It's like shifts from a serious thing, but it's also like you see Harwood in this, like, very villainous role. Obviously, he thinks of himself as a hero that, in his own right, it's like, oh, I'm doing what's best for England, for London, as England as a whole, like, so it's always weird when you see that him shift into a different light when he's around Peg and Bet, and they're trying to figure things out. He's buying them enough time, being like, okay, I'll surrender, but I will wait for Salt to get here to do it. So obviously Salt's like, no one harms Harwood, but when the time comes, Harwood's like, oh, I'll stumble, I'll trip or faint or something like that. Give you guys enough time to get out of here, and if you manage to get away, let Gaunt know that I am really sorry for being fooled and everything. And he kind of says his goodbyes to both of them. They're like, but what about you? And it's like in that moment, because I love that Bet. It's like, oh, you're coming up with a plan? Oh, it's going to be to kill him, right? I'm down for that. But, and in that moment, you can tell, and they can tell, Harwood plans on sacrificing himself, because it's like, oh, you won't use me, even, he gets in front of all his men, and it's like, oh, you need to all lay down your arms because this war isn't like on a righteous front anymore. And so he points a gun at Salt and is like, you guys better, you got to the count of 3, and Salt's still telling them don't do it, and he's walking closer, and they all end up putting Harwood down. So what kind of effect this has on John's plan is going to be interesting, but we do see Peg and Bet, manage to escape. It's sad, because I'm assuming that, when it's all said and done, they will manage to get Gaunt free, and she is the voice of reason for the Raven side of things, not Salt. So she might be able to convey some of this, like, stop this from happening. Who knows? Because I think if she manages to get free, it'll just be a situation of, well, she'll be looked at as like the one that was locked away, the traitor, and stuff like that. I even love that line where like Harwood was like, oh yeah, like, I beat some young boy to death or whatever. And then you have Bet being like, oh, it happened, it happens or something like that. She says something in that vein, which is like, of course you would say that, because it's like your current circumstances are because you killed someone. So it's like, she's like, it was almost like it could happen to anyone type of thing, or these things happen type of thing, So I just, their reunion was because obviously, like, they haven't been able to keep in touch because obviously he's been running, the Ravens and stuff like that, being the leader and, kind of conquering and everything. So for them to have this one last moment together is sweet yet bittersweet and sad. It's like, oh. But at the end of the day, they were still like, the only friends he really had outside of everything, and it's like he can rely on them, Because for him, it's like the most important thing was their survival. And you're like, oh, because, and it's coming full circle because Bet and Peg, brought him back to life. They got him back on his feet, quite literally, not quite literally, straight up literally. And so I think for him, it's only in kind that I sacrificed myself for the two women that brought me back to life. You know, I was like, oh, it's a bittersweet ending in that regard. But granted, yeah, he's still a villain in his own right. But it's just the interesting, like, weird lane of villain that you would technically put him in is kind of interesting. So, regardless, you know, I'm really interested to ultimately see where everything ends up taking us going forward into the next episode, because how will they really be able to stop Stormcloud from coming? Maybe considering, like I said, this will put a damper on John Salt's, you know, like plans and stuff like that, but maybe that still won't be enough. We'll have to wait and see. Bet and Peg saving Gaunt. Maybe at that point too, since Alfred's staying behind and helping, there's gonna be more like, hey, Bet, Alfred. We haven't, you know, they probably haven't seen each other since they definitely haven't seen each other since like season 1. Since, like, you know, they all got arrested at the end of season 1. That was probably the last time they've seen each other, really heard each other. So that's going to be interesting to see. I think that's going to be how those storylines, both sides of things, kind of join the forces in that of like, oh, we got to stop this terrible thing, Stormcloud, from happening. So, like I said, we'll ultimately have to wait and see where everything ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.